What's up YouTube? I'm the Ultimate Apocalypse, and this is going to be my first full mix breakdown video on my channel. I've been wanting to do this for some other previous releases, but I didn't, and so here we are with this one. So this is going to be the full entire mix for War Ensemble. I'll break everything down for you, tell you exactly what I did, show you on the screen what's going on, and hopefully you'll get something out of this. So, the very concept of this song, I wanted this to be as extreme and insane as I could make it. War itself is crazy and scary, and I wanted to represent that with the song and the video for this. If you've not seen the music video for it, the link is in the description below, or you can find it on my channel. Otherwise, it's also on Apple Music and Spotify. So for the recording of the song, I recorded myself playing drums. Here's all the microphones that I used for my drum set. And then when I bring it into Logic, I use Superior Drummer 3 and the Superior Drummer 3 tracker so I can do sample augmentation. And so for the drum samples, I'm using Metal Machinery as well as a bunch of drum shots. For the guitars, I'm using Shreddage 3 Jupiter. I found Jupiter to be the best fit among their guitar line for the faster riffs. I tried Hydra, it just got a little bit too muddy, so Jupiter worked out better for this. And then for the bass guitar, I used Shreddage 3 Abyss. For the orchestra, I'm using Spitfire Studio Orchestra Professional, and I'm using the close mics on all the instruments. There's also some Native Instruments Symphony series, especially with their percussion. For the hybrid sound effects stuff, I'm using a lot of Heaviosity, so NOVO, FORZO, and VENTO. For all the impacts, I'm using Gravity, Damage 2, Native Instruments, Rise and Hit. And then for like extra sound effects and stuff, I'm also using Boom Library, Fire and Water for like the ending and some of the fire effects. So they give out free monthly sounds. And so they gave out gunshots. And so the gunshots that you hear in the last pre-chorus, those are from Boom Sound Libraries for free. So that's pretty dope. Okay, so I think that covers all the instruments that we used. And then for the guitar solo, that was actually my buddy Kenny, who plays for the band Red Pillars. And they practiced right next to me at a rehearsal spot. And so I was able to get him on this, and he played the guitar solo for me. I got the DI signal, ran it through my own apps that I'll show you here. We filmed the video to it, and he was a badass. So thank you, Kenny, for all of your help on this. All right, so let's dive into the mix, and I'll show you everything that's going on. Here's all the tracks going down the list. Just to give you an idea of all the things that are actually going on. You'll notice there's these folders. So summing stacks are awesome because they basically, you take all these tracks in a group, set it to a summing stack, and then you can have effects on each individual track or on the group as a whole. What I've done is I've broken Logic, and so I've got these summing stacks here. So all these tracks are going into a summing stack, and then these different summing stacks are going to another summing stack. So I've got nested summing stacks. How I got that was I had the summing stack to the folder track, and then I had the folder track to an auxiliary, and then I right-clicked that auxiliary track and said create track, and somehow that auxiliary went and overwrote the folder track and made it into a summing stack. I have not been able to recreate it. So all of these nested summing stacks you see are all the same instance copied and repurposed for all the different groups. And now it's part of my template, and I don't ever want to get rid of it. Okay, so let's dive right in. The intro is 2 tracks. So NOVO from Heaviosity, and then I believe this is Evolve from Heaviosity as well. So if we play this noise, so that's Evolve, and then NOVO, I stacked this sample on top of that. And then together. And so that kind of builds up the tension in the beginning. And then down here, Grim Reaper's Lair is a preset on Heaviosity NOVO. So that's kind of the ambience that builds into that first impact. And this guy right here. And then this cut you see right here where the volume dips, I actually modified the gain staging for this cut so that volume goes down when the song hits on that first main impact. So let's get back out of here. So that's the intro. Pretty simple. All right, so for drums, let's break this all down. So you'll see this folder right here called Drum Spikes. The folder itself is muted, or folder summing stack. So this bus contains all of these key spikes. And what these are is when I recorded the drums and put them into Superior Drummer 3, I extracted the MIDI data from all the transients on the drums. I then copy that MIDI data onto synth tracks and make those MIDI notes as high pitched as I can and as short as possible. And then what that'll do is it'll create little tiny clicks that are exactly when the drums hit. So that way, these clicks are what I'm using to sidechain into gates and compressors on other tracks. So when I got the guitar going on, every time there's a snare hit, that triggers a gate that will duck the guitar down slightly every snare hit. So that way you can have loud guitars and then get the full body of the snare just on the impact. I'll show you more of that as we get into it, but that's the purpose of these key spikes. And I have them on for all the drums. So I have a kick drum, a snare drum, and then one for all the toms, and then one for each individual tom. For the individual toms, what those do, so for this tom 1 spike, for every key spike, that will open up the gate for allowing the tom microphone signal through. I'll show you that later, but that's what these key spikes are. And if you just want to hear how it's ridiculous it sounds playing this on its own, that's all it is, a bunch of little tiny clicks. Bunch of little tiny clicks that go right along with the drums. So let's put that back in mute because we don't want that in the mix. All right, so for overheads, I have these 6 main ones. So bell and ride. Bell is right over the hi-hat, and then ride is the ride cymbal on my right side. So those are panned hard left, hard right. And then China left and China right are these 2 guys right here. So I've my 2 China cymbals right here, one above my left and then up on my right. And then overhead left and right, OL and OR, are an XY pair above my whole kit that point to the left and to the right. So all these I have hard panned, hard left and hard right to give the maximum amount of width. So for the plugins, let's go on the bell. So the first one I have is auto align, and I already set this. So the snare microphone way over here, that is what I'm using as the baseline to send the signal for auto align. And then you'll see this is set up to receive, and it's marked at -122 samples. And then Pro Q3. So here's the EQ curve for the bell microphone. I've got it high pass pretty high, and then high cut as well. And then this is sort of the body of the bell, and then a little bit more of the ting in this bump right here. And there's a part right here where I play specifically on the bell, and you can hear what that sounds like on its own. So that's the bell for you. And then China left, auto align, same to line it up with the snare. And then Pro Q3, high pass it up quite a bit, and then bump it up at the higher frequencies just to give it some more brightness. Overhead left, auto align, and then I have DF clip to level out the signal. So I'm clipping the signal, and so if I turn this off, and then I'll turn it on. So it brings that signal up and kind of levels things out a little bit. So clipping, and then EQ, high passing, and then bump it up the high end to brighten things up. So we've done the left ones. The right overhead microphones are basically mirror images of the left. So you'll see these gain plugins down at the bottom all over here. Those I use to automate. So if I bring up automation, you'll see right here I have a little bump on a ride hit. So if I solo that, so I wanted that ride hit to be a little bit louder. So I make all of my automation moves on gain plugins. I don't want to automate on the volume fader because that's going to lock the fader in place. I want to be able to move the faders up and down to rebalance things if needed. Putting it on the gain plugin allows me to still use the faders freely. And then for the overhead whole bus, I have DF comp set on, I kind of screwed up, left it on kick mode, but I'm not really doing much compression, not a whole lot going on. You'll see I made some mistakes and maybe some questionable choices, but oops. So then I have DF clarify. This kind of smooths out the high-end harshness of the cymbals. I have it set to real-time mode, weight and smoothness, or here's all the settings, you can check that out. And then Pro Q3, I just kind of dip down the low ends to get that out of the way of the rest of the drum mix. Rooms. So room left and right, I pan them opposite because I don't know why. Auto align, I did auto align the room mics. I don't know if that's better or worse. I think I liked it better as auto aligned, although typically you don't normally auto align room microphones. DF clip to clip the signal, kind of cut things off and bring it up as a whole, and a little bit distortion. And Pro Q3, give a little bit of high pass and then high cut, and then boost up the brightness a little bit in that, what is that, 5.8 K hertz. And then also you see these buses going in places. Those are going to be on the drum reverb and the drum parallel compression. We'll get to that when we get to it. Here's what the overheads sound like all together. And then let's go to that fill over here. Here's what the room mics sound like. Alright, kick drum. So this is kind of fun. Check this out. I have my kick sample. I'm not using the audio from the microphones on the kick drum. The kick drums are stuffed pretty heavily and the microphone signal sounds like garbage, but I do record the audio so that I can get the dynamics from my performance and then use that in the MIDI information to get a more human sounding sample set. It sounds better to me. And that way I can separate left kick from right kick and get the two different sample sets going. So here's what the kick drum sounds like on this track. So I've entirely high-passed all of the low end and the punch. I took out some of the boxiness at around 800 Hertz and then bumped up the attack at 7K. The low end is on a whole separate track. That's this guy right here. And this is actually a synth. So like I did with the key spikes, I put all those MIDI notes on just a regular, the Logic sampler stock settings and bumped those up all the way as high as I can go. For the kick drum low end, I have a synth note that plays. I have it set to like 30 samples long, so it's a very short signal. As you can see right here, it's barely one whole period. So it's a very super tight kick drum low end. And I even have it EQ'd here. So because it comes in so sharply and it ends so abruptly, there's some high end click that comes through. And so let me play this for you. So you can see that I'm cutting off all that high end information because I want just that low end. And so the fundamental is set at 86 Hertz. So 86 times 2 will give you that octave up that's around here. 86 times 1.5 will give you that kind of cancellation frequency, which is 129. So I boost 86, cut 129, and then kind of boost up to where the octave doubles up. So that's where the low end is at. So when you combine the low end and the high end, pretty cool, huh? And so on the kick drum bus, so these are going to their own stack. Kick drum bus, I got some DF Excite. Treble is set to like 1, and all these other ones are turned off just to give a little bit more excitement to that attack. And then DFQ, whole lot of attack, and then I think there's no punch, because that's all coming through. If I need more punch, I just turn up that kick low end fader by adding a lot of attack through DFQ. And then, all right, let's move on to snare. So snare microphone. So this is the SM57 that's on the snare. Let me solo this and you can hear that as it is. Alright, so auto align. This is the source signal for all the auto align on the overheads, and that gets sent over through the send signal. Pro G. So remember those key spikes? So the snare key spike is triggering this gate, and that's bumping up the signal every time the snare hits. So that way any bleed or anything that's coming through, that's still there, it's still audible, but it's lessened because of this gate. And so you see on the graph, the light blue is the audio signal that's coming in. All the dark blue that you're seeing above that signal is the audio that's getting cut off. So the bleed is getting reduced. That way it still sounds like a live snare, but it's a lot cleaner of a signal. So all those dark bits are where the signal is getting reduced. DFQ for the snare, whole lot of attack, some clarity, and some extra punch. So if I turn this off, pretty big difference. So I'm combining that with a snare sample. This is the metal machinery and those drum shots coming into play. So the snare sample track on its own sounds like this. So for the snare sample track, I'm inverting the phase with this gain plugin, so that way it gives it a fatter sound when it combines with the snare microphone. Pro Q, here's the EQ for the snare, high passing it a little bit, bumping up that 200 Hertz, that punch range, and then bumping up some of the treble frequencies and cutting out some of that harshness up in 13K. So if I play you just this, so this really piercing snare, like wiry sound, I'm cutting some of that out of the signal. And then this is about where my attack is like. So that's the snare sample track. And then this fill track, this is just kind of an extra support track for those important Slayer Dave Lombardo drum fills. EQ curve, I'm just making it brighter, and that's for just give some extra nastiness to that fill. We all know that War Ensemble drum fill going into the bridge. And then finishing with that last hit right here as everything gets back in. So the snare bus, let's see, DF Excite. What do I got here? I've got a little bit of low mid, a tiny little bit of treble. Not much was needed from this plugin. Pro Q3, here's, I'm doing kind of a lot here. So I'm keeping this 200 hertz range, that's where you get like the punch in the body of the snare drum. Cutting out some of this 285, let's see what that is. So kind of some like boxy resonant frequencies that weren't really working for me. And then as I was mixing this, I wanted my snare to be brighter and brighter to cut through better in the mix. So I kept boosting up this high end, taking out some of these frequencies that I didn't really like. I have this Pro Q3 set to auto gain mode so that if I turn it up in the high end, the gain coming out of the plugin won't change. So that way I don't need to worry about rebalancing my snare if I make an EQ move. Alright, I believe that's all for the snare. So let's move on to tom microphones. Alright, so toms. The only thing that are on the tom microphone tracks, Pro G, gates. So all of these are set to, so tom 1 is listening to the tom 1 spike signal. And anytime that tom 1 spike happens is going to be where the tom 1 hits. So let me show you without the gate what tom 1 track sounds like. So all kinds of stuff going on in there. If I turn that gate on, here's what that same track sounds like. So notice the dynamics of this track. There's a lot of hits over here that are about the same level as the hits in the actual fill itself. But because this gate is listening to those key spikes that I've already established are where the actual tom hits are, it's going to respond to that already perfect reference. So I don't need to worry about any of the dynamics around any of the other parts of the track. I know that the gate is going to open only precisely when I hit the drum. So that's basically the whole story for all the tom mics. They're all listening to their own respective tom key spikes. So on the tom bus right here, gain plugin to invert the phase, DFQ, some attack and some punch to get some more attack and punch. DF Excite, I'm bumping up some bass, and am I doing a little tiny little bit more of attack through the exciter. Just kind of add some saturation in there. And let's move on to the samples. So tom 1 sample, all the toms here, there's nothing going on the individual tracks. I've already selected what tom samples I want, and they sound great. So the processing I'm doing is right here, first off, inverting the phase. I've noticed I re-inverted the phase, so that kind of, this is a little bit useless. Screw that up, my bad. DFQ, add some attack and some punch to the tom samples, and DF Excite to bump up more of that low end so I can get more of the rumble that cuts through. Not really much else, maybe a little bit of treble it looks like. So let's see, let's do this fill right here. So that's the tom samples, and let's bring in the microphones with the samples. So that way you get more of the human side with the microphones, and then also what a listener would expect to hear in a modern metal mix with the samples. Blend those two in to taste, and that's the sound I ended up with. Alright, so all these buses, these bus 21 and bus 37, those are going to drum reverb and parallel compression. So my reverb, I'm using Pro R. So here's my settings for the drum reverb. Doing a high pass and a high cut, so all the reverb is kind of filtered in the upper mids. Here's all the knobs for that. So parallel compression bus, I'm using supercharger as the main kind of first bus, and if we solo this, so this is doing a couple different things. It's got a saturation knob built into it, and then it's got a little compression ratios at 225, and then some fatness. Whatever this does, I think it does some kind of low end saturation or something, but it's on the fat setting. Adding some fatness characters all the way up to what, at 1 o'clock. And then input gain right here. I really like this, how it recommends the input trim that you use for it. So that's all actually going into the Joel Wanasek bus glue for drums. So this bus glue I basically have set until I see some dB of gain reduction, just to kind of squash everything and keep it very consistent leveled. And then going into Pro Q3, this is the EQ I ended up with to try to get the drum compression bus audible without getting in the way of all the low tones. Keep this sort of cleaned up down here, as well as some of the harshness up here. And so all the drums together sound like this. So you probably noticed that fill right there got a little bit louder because I have a gain plugin right here that's doing all the drum automation throughout the song. All right, let's collapse all the drums, move on to bass. So bass, they updated Bass Forge Hellraiser, which is what I used, and my original setting got lost because the plugin no longer works. So thanks, Joey. I've reloaded a new instance of Hellraiser. I remember picking a preset. I think it was this one. So Brute Boy is the preset I picked. I'll turn it off for now, and here is the bass tone. So that's programmed bass from Shredders 3 Abyss. And I'll turn on the amp. And there we go. So settings for this, just Brute Boy preset. Sounds dope. So then there's a bunch of other stuff going on here. This is basically for dynamics, to get the bass sitting with the rest of the mix. So it starts with the Pro G. So this is what I'm using. You see how this ramp goes up and then it dips down right here and then continues up. So this is actually sidechained to the snare spike. So every time the snare hits, the bass guitar is going to dip down 4 dB. For 30 milliseconds. So that's not a very long time to have a dip down, so you're not gonna notice it in the context of the mix. There's another one for the toms. So this is where the all tom spikes come in. So I don't want to gate for every single different tom. So I have that all tom spikes track that the bass guitar and also the guitar is listening to. That's only ducking down by 2 dB, so that way it's not as much of a prominent duck as the snare drum. But yeah, every time the snare and any tom hits, that's going to duck down the whole bass track just a little bit, just for a very short amount of time, to make sure you get that full impact of that drum hit. At least that's the idea behind it. And that concept came from Machine, the producer. Thank you, dude. That's been an awesome trick. And now you watching this know about it too. So here's the EQ for the bass guitar. Cut out all the high end up to 5.9K, boosted like 1.8 just slightly. Cut out some of the mid-range just to give more room for the other instruments, because there's a whole bunch of guitars and orchestra and stuff going on. This wasn't really adding to the bass tone that I was looking for, so I just cut it out a little bit. And there's a bunch of stuff going on here to try to, my attempt at cleaning up the low end in the bass guitar. 86 Hertz, I cut that down automatically because that's where the kick drum lives. And then some of this other stuff, this is where a lot of the low end of the guitars was fighting. And I was doing my best to get the bass guitar and the low end of the regular rhythm guitars to sit properly together. This is what I ended up with. Alright, so Pro MB, I got 3 things going on with this. So this first Pro MB is to level out the bass dynamics. So this is to bring down the low end, to kind of get the low end to sit tighter and be less dynamic, because if you have a dynamic low end, that can kind of throw off all the compressors and the master bus and all that stuff. So keep the bass consistent in the low end. And then I also brought up some of the mid-range and some of the high end. So this setting right here was actually recommended to me by Joe Scalata from URM Academy. I'm part of URM Enhance, and I can do one-on-one Skype calls with experts in mixing. And so I can send them my tracks and they can give me recommendations on what to do. This specific Pro MB instance is some feedback I got from him. Helped me kind of level up my bass tone and get it sounding more in the pocket. Thank you, Joe. The next Pro MB, this is focused on 86 Hertz again. So every time the kick drum hits, not only is the EQ carved down, but this will bump down the 86 Hertz slightly even more. I have this set to, well, actually -6 dB. So that way, every time the kick drum hits, you get that fundamental low end bump in the kick drum, and the bass guitar will duck out of the way. So that way you don't have a whole lot of buildup in that area. You're only hearing what is important in that instance. So of course I have this set to the kick spike, so that way I can have the perfect reference for where this compressor is supposed to be acting. And I have it set to sidechain mode, and I have it moved all the way up because the kick spikes are very high tuned. So it's listening to that high end frequency to know when to duck down this low end of the bass guitar. The next one, This is for the low end of the toms, and I also have this listening to the all tom spike track. So anytime a tom hits, it's ducking down the rumble area of the bass guitar, so that way when you hit the tom, you want that low end to kind of punch through, and for it to punch through, you have to kind of move other things out of the way. So this is me moving the bass guitar out of the way of the low end of the toms. So that's bass guitar. On to rhythm guitar. I have the DI signal here from Shreddage 3 Jupiter, and if I mute the amps, this is what we got. So let's go to a verse so you can hear some fast picking stuff. So that's Shreddage 3 Jupiter for you. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm putting on Spiff. This is a transient enhancer from OX Sound. I think that's how you say it. So what this does is I'm sort of simulating extra pick attack. And so I have the electric guitar pick attack setting on here. And so if you have a harder pick attack and then send that signal through your amp, a harder pick attack will have more defined notes. So I have my velocities set in the MIDI for shreddage, and then what I'm doing is I'm exporting the audio and then bringing that into Spiff, which is a transient enhancer to stimulate extra aggression for that pick attack. It's a subtle change, but check this out. So if I turn this off, and then I'll turn it back on in the middle of this verse and see if you notice more aggression in that performance. So it sort of simulates sounding like they're hitting the guitar a little bit harder. And then I send that through the guitar sim. So this is Archetype Gojira. I didn't play around with this a whole lot because it just sounded awesome, whatever preset I picked. So I'm using a more high-end gain tone. That's kind of what I was going for, so that way you can get the high-end attack of the guitar, because it says Slayer and guitars are very important, even though I want all the orchestra. But that's the guitar tone for the left. And keep in mind that the bus, all of this stuff is still active. The EQs and everything are active on the guitar bus. But that's what is going through the left channel. And then for the right channel, DI from Shreddage 3 Jupiter, and then Spiff, and then Tone Forge Jeff Loomis for the right channel. And then here's what this sounds like. So that's for the right. I have this super big rhythm preset that I kind of tweaked and made a little bit more high-end gainy, and here's the settings for that. Well, I don't think I really changed much of anything else. Oh, a little bit more in the treble. Didn't touch that. And then this gain plugin for automation. All right, so for the guitar bus, so I have Joel Nosek bus glue guitars to kind of keep the guitars leveled out, consistent, like the bass guitar. I have Chug Slayer active to kind of eliminate some of that low-end buildup from some of the palm mutes that are going on in this song. Pro G, so these guys, just like the bass guitar, ducking down every time the snare hits, and then ducking down every time the tom hits. These are the same settings as on the bass guitar. And then Pro Q3, so here's my guitar EQ that I ended up with. So the idea behind this is I'm focusing on the EQ points that add to the tone, or to the performance, or to the body, and boosting those, and I'm being more precise with it than I normally would be. Because there's so many other things going on in the orchestra, I gotta make sure that where I put my EQ moves is very specific and tailored to what this song needs. Also keep in mind, I'm just a dude in his bedroom. I'm not a professional by any means. This took me forever to put together. This is what I ended up with, and then hopefully it sounds pretty cool. Here's EQ. So I'll solo each one of these bands so you can hear where I'm making my moves. So the low end, give it some body and thickness. So this 500 Hertz is a lot of your pick attack. That's sort of where the definition is happening in the guitar, while also in sort of like the low end body range. And then if you kind of double that, you'll get into this area, which is more the attack side of the pick attack. So that's kind of your high-end definition sound. And then you have some of these gross frequencies. So I'll solo some of these cuts that I did. So some of the fizz that just doesn't really add to the tone that I'm looking for. 4K, nobody likes 4K in guitars. And now I understand why. And then this is just kind of a weird whistle that I wanted to get rid of. So I'm making like 4 or 5 cuts here, and I think half of these were recommended to me by Joe from URM. And then boosting at 5.3K to give back some of that high-end attack, some of that nastiness that we love in distorted guitars. Doesn't sound good on its own, but in context. And then gain plugin for automation. Here's all my guitar automation throughout the song, some stuff over here. Yeah, I guess that's it for guitars. So guitar solo, I was having a very hard time mixing this because my computer was not cooperating with me. Every time I would go to play the solo, it would freeze up on me. And we'll see if it happens right now. But here's the guitar solo. So I recorded the DI, added spiff to enhance those DI pick attacks, and then threw on Tone Forge Jeff Loomis. There's a different setting, a solo cutter, and then I might have made some tweaks to it. Pro Q3, here's the EQ moves I made on the guitar solo track. So boosted 666, because that's fucking metal. That's the low end body of the pick attack, or like the definition of the guitar notes. And then sort of the high end of that guitar note definition. Cut out these frequencies a little bit more aggressively where there's just like some high end fizz and stuff that doesn't really sound cool, like whistly and fizzy and gross. And then bumped up the high end to allow the guitar solo to cut through on that high end as guitar solos generally should. And also to kind of even out with the rest of these moves. So a lot more extreme EQ on the guitar solo, but that's what I ended up with to get everything to sit in the mix and sound as good as I can make it. So Timeless 3, this is a delay plugin that's pretty new from FabFilter. So I have this thrown on here, and then you can see there's an automation here, mix, as well as feedback. So I'm automating the delay to be more extreme at the end of the solo. So that last note, I wanted that to kind of ring out and bounce back and forth and taper itself back into the song. And that's how I did that. I'm still getting used to this plugin, still learning it, but that's what I ended up with and that's what I managed to do. Kind of same basic thing for the guitar solo over here. Whole lot of automation for the gain, some panning for the when it gets back into the verse, and then there's like the bends going back and forth while I'm singing. So I have that kind of in the background as the gain gets reduced during that part. So that's this part of the solo. And then hear how that delay kind of decays over time. So as those increase, the mix increases, the delay increases, and it gets a little bit more chaotic as it fades into the middle of the third verse. All right, on to orchestra. So orchestra is a whole huge folder of stuff. So we got strings, brass, woodwinds, and choir. So all the EQ on these, very generally, so for violin 1, I'll use this as an example. You'll notice there's a gain plugin on here so that I can do some automation on this one specifically. So Pro Q3, so I'm basically doing a lot of high passing and then bumping up where I find the character of the instrument to be. So every one of these individual tracks for violin 1, 2, violas, cello, basses, and then some, these are like kind of effects, some extra fancy business going on top. I really just focus on the frequencies that I like out of that instrument. This kind of brightens it up a little bit and then cuts out all the low end that doesn't really need to be there for a violin. Yeah, so here's my EQ curve for violin 2. Violas, cut out some of the boxiness in that. Cello, cut out some boxiness, boosted some of the more like kind of upper mids. Basses, you notice how as the lower the instrument gets in its natural frequency response, the lower the high pass gets. Violins 1 legato, violin decor. So what these are, violin 1 legato. That's really just adding some spookiness to the beginning of the song and to like any kind of interludes or anything. Violin decor, that's these guys. So any kind of like trills and stuff, I have those on their own track, so that way I can have the other violins and other cello and stuff sticking to the main melody. Cello decor, same kind of deal as the violin decor, just on a cello. And so when you have the whole strings together, I have the EQ on the strings bus, which is, as you can see here, cut out some of the mid-range boxiness and boost 2 points where I find kind of upper mid and then higher end character to the strings bus. And then strings on their own sound about like this. You know what, there are gates going on, just like we had on guitar and bass, to where anytime the snare or the toms hit, it's cutting out a couple dB. So I'm going to turn those off for now, because it gets a little bit distracting. And then back to strings. So you hear that little trill in there, the violin decor? Alright, and then I have them roughly balanced. Strings are panned a little bit to the left, and then woodwinds are panned a little bit to the right, because they serve similar purposes in the orchestra from what I understand. I don't know a whole lot. I didn't study this in school or anything. But strings and woodwinds slightly left and right of each other, and then brass up the middle, because those are what are epic. So that's real quick overview of the strings. Brass, we got trumpets. So the horns are French horns. I put a limiter on the French horns to kind of control the dynamics. So you can see the French horns are quite dynamic. There's these like random spikes, and then it gets pretty solid, and then there's more random spikes. So I put a Pro L on here. It's not doing a whole lot, but it's there just to kind of level off the more intense stabs, I guess. So basically, I'll go run down the EQ of these instruments. So here's my trumpet EQ curve. Here's the French horns EQ. Oh shit, what the hell is this? Trombones EQ, bass trombone EQ. Here's some basso. Tuba, I also have a limiter on, similar concept to the French horns. And then here's the EQ for the tuba. Notice again that the lower the instrument registers, the lower the EQ curves sit, because that's where the character of that instrument is. So trumpet decor, so similar concepts to the violin decor, all the trills and fancy business that gets stacked onto its own track. So listen for this right here. And then here's the EQ curve for the brass, brightening things up a little bit. Gain for automation. Here's what the pre-chorus into the chorus sounds like for the brass. That's during the guitar solo. So that's about it for brass. Woodwinds, I'll run down the EQ curve for this. So the piccolo flute, very high pass, and then bumping up the high end, because that's where the piccolo lives. And then we got the flutes. So this is an interesting one. The flutes, there is a particular frequency right here that sticks out during the, I believe that's the pre-chorus. So that last double stab, that frequency lives right here, and it somehow pokes through the entire mix, and I can hear it above everything else. And that's at this frequency right here. Let me play that back for you, and you'll hear when that frequency builds up when I put it in solo. So I took that out of the mix because that was poking way too far, but then overall I brightened it up for the flutes. Clarinets, I have this similar EQ curve. Here's the oboes and cor anglios. These ones. So the oboes and the other ones that sound like oboes. So Christian Henson, who is one of the founders of Spitfire Audio, he did a video on oboes and cor anglios, however you say it. And he was basically explaining that you say oboe, but you listen more to the cor anglios. And so they kind of serve the same sort of purpose in the orchestra, so I just kind of combine them on the same track and treat them as one thing. Here's the bassoons, lower registers, and then contrabassoon, which is very low register, and I even cut the 86 hertz to leave room for the kick drum. So the Woodwinds as a whole group, the EQ curve is right here, so boosting more of the mids and actually cutting out some of the high end. So I know I boosted a lot of the piccolo flute and the flute high end. I'm cutting that out in the group to leave more room for the brass and the strings. So I'll play that pre-chorus for you, since that's a part where all of the Woodwinds are playing, and you'll hear the piccolo flute cutting through as well. So you probably notice this EQ curve down here moving. This is actually a dynamic high cut filter. I want to maintain as much of the high end as possible, but if it gets too extreme, then I start ducking it down to kind of tame it. Then we have choir. So there's a bunch of different kind of things going on with the choir. So for the choir, I didn't mention this earlier, I'm using Strezov libraries. So Freya, Wotan, and then Storm Choir Ultimate. Strezov makes kick-ass choirs, and I really like how they sound, and here's what Freya sounds like. This is during the pre-chorus. There's a woman solo voice going off in the side that you will hear. Here it is in solo. That's one of the things that I really wanted to stick out in the mix. I really like how that kind of, it's spooky, and it kind of adds some more kind of weird atmosphere to that pre-chorus and kind of builds up that tension a little bit. So that's where that's coming from. EQ curves for all this. So Freya is an all-female choir, and here's the EQ curve for this. So cutting out some of the whatever weird stuff going on in here and boosting to the high end for those female vocals. So Storm Choir Ultimate, Woman, O, A, Legato. So this is one of the presets they have. It goes O to A as you hold out the notes. High pass and then brighten up a little bit. Storm Choir Ultimate Woman. This is Woman choir, where they have a bunch of different articulations that you can choose between. High pass, a little bit of brightness. And then Storm Choir Ultimate Men, same deal, where they have a bunch of different syllables you can choose from, and then you just program those in. Here's the EQ curve for the men. And then Wotan is a men's choir that's geared toward like low-end epic. So the best example I can think of is the new God of War 2018. When you hear those low male choirs, that's kind of what this library could serve that purpose for. Here's what Wotan sounds like on its own. So yeah, those very low male vocals, and then all the choirs together. Another very intense choir part is the second half of the bridge. In the video, this is after Madeleine Albright admits that she doesn't care about dead kids. So it's a very WTF moment in the video, and right at that moment, I want this song to just come in and completely overwhelm the listener. So you don't get any of that political commentary in the audio-only version. You gotta watch the music video for that. That's probably why I got age restricted. So here is the most epic part of the choirs, and you'll hear female choir. So the Storm Choir, that's like a more epic vibe. So you got the women and the men. For the Wotan, you've got like these shouts going on. So you hear these shouts going off to the side. So here's what the choir sounds like on that second half of the bridge. And I'll play that just in context of the song, because that's one of my favorite parts of this whole thing. So there's a lot of stuff happening, which is kind of unfortunate in the sense that I want the choirs to be huge, but I also want the brass to be huge, and I also want the strings to be huge, and I also want the guitars to be huge, and I also want the drums to be huge, and I also want the vocals to be... There's no way to make everything up in front, so I have to be very picky and specific about where I set things. The reality of mixing, it's all just compromise. But that's where it ended up. So that's the choir for you. Also going into the orchestra bus at this very end over here. We'll get to that in a bit. Heaviosity FORZO. There's a preset called Epic Hands that I think sounds epic. And here that part is, so I really have the whole thing kind of turned down a little bit, except for that part that we just heard. So here's what that sounds like. So I've got a limiter on this to kind of keep the dynamics pretty straightforward, and then I'm using a gain plugin for automation to decide when I want it to be louder or not. So limiting, and then here's my EQ curve. So I'm doing kind of a pretty intense high pass, and then boosting up some, what is that, 4.7K to give it a little bit more brightness, because I don't want the low end to build up from this, because there is a lot of low end. Let me play this for you. So notice that whole huge bump around 20 hertz. We don't need that. That's not going to contribute to the song. It's just going to muddy things up in the low end where the kick drum and the bass guitar need to live. So that's everything with the orchestra except for Orchestra Reverb. So this bus 23 is going back over here to this Orchestra Reverb track, and I'm using Pro R. Here's the settings for that. So decay rate, it's decaying pretty quickly on the high end, kind of preserving a lot of the things on the low end. Maybe I should have reversed that, I don't know. And then high passing the post EQ for that reverb. So here's the orchestra reverb on its own. And then the orchestra as a whole, including the epic hands. Let's go back to that bridge 2 part. Alright, so that's the whole orchestra. And that's pretty much the core of the song, except I got all these other tracks going on with all kinds of crazy business. So basically, I have an entire hybrid orchestra. So these are a bunch of tracks from Heaviosity's NOVO, FORZO, and VENTO. And I'm using these as sound design elements. So like we saw earlier, this guy right here. This is just a preset from Heaviosity NOVO, and I've named the tracks after the preset that I chose. So this is called Grim Reaper's Lair. That's a preset in NOVO that sounded really cool, and I wanted to include all these sound design elements in here. NOVO is basically like their hybrid string library. So they took a bunch of strings, violins, all that stuff, and then they have the actual sounds in there. But I'm using the Spitfire Orchestra, and I didn't want to stack that on top of this. So they actually recorded all the strings and the brass and the woodwinds, and then they took those samples. You can use those as their own samples, but then they also did a whole bunch of sound design stuff, which is what I'm using here. So it's a whole like secondary weird ambient horror vibe I'm trying to go for. Just spooky business going on, and then hell waves coming in, very high end kind of thing. And all of that is going on during that first introduction sequence as the whole song is getting started, and it's building up to this first impact into the first verse. So that's going on, and then it comes into whatever this guy is. So the ending of that right here. So I realize a lot of this is getting lost in the mix of the whole band and the orchestra and all kinds of other stuff going on. So this is just a bunch of noise in the background. The idea is to add as much chaos as possible. Ultimately in the mix, a lot of this stuff isn't really noticeable, but I notice when it's not there. So if I go through like a track, let's see, on this pre-chorus right here. So more Grim Reaper's Lair. So I'll mute this in the pre-chorus and see if you hear any difference in the kind of the background support ambience. I'll turn that back on. Probably didn't notice the difference, but this is what was missing. So just a bunch of spooky stuff going on, and then this is actually very noticeable if you know that it's there and you're listening for it. So this right here. So when it swells up into that higher range, you can definitely pick that apart from everything else that's happening. So I'll unsolo this and listen for that little trickling effect, and it starts during the first main drum fill. You hear like that digital noise that kind of creeps in and out? That's coming from this. It's a NOVO. And then it also happens during the bridge down section. So definitely more subtle there. More just stuff going on here. So same kind of concept with these EQs. I'm just focusing on the frequencies that add to the experience. So here's the fantasy, and then high textures, a lot of high passing, because I don't want there's a lot of low end in these libraries. I didn't want that to interfere with the guitars and the bass and the drums and all that other stuff that actually is what you're expecting the power of the mix to come from. But for Grim Reaper's Lair, so because that starts off in the intro, and then it kind of builds up into that first impact of the song, I have this low end turned up pretty high. And then I automate it downwards into that first hit. So let me play this in context of the whole mix. So it's got that low end build up, and then the low end disappears as the first hit comes in. And that first hit is coming from one of the impacts down in one of the lower tracks. But I reduce the low end to kind of suck out the energy, and then the impact hits to bring that energy back in. And then Hell Waves, I just left that as it is. What's even going on there? So it's very high-end focused. I guess I could have high passed that, but you don't hear it anyway, so whatever. So this is going on during the pre-chorus. So let me play that in context and see if you can pick that out from everything else. Even when I turn it all the way up, I can't hear it, but I want it there because it sounds spooky and I like it and it makes me feel better. Let's move on to FORZO. So same kind of concept with the EQs, a lot of high passing. After the Storm is actually an important one for me. So this has some very piercing noises that are going on during the bridge. And so see if you can pick out that high-end frequency in this part. So I wanted that to be audible, but obviously there's other more important things happening in the mix. That's there. I like it. There's other stuff going on. What is this? I don't even know what some of these are. Weird spooky stuff. So when I was coming up with this arrangement, I was like, all right, I want like 4 or 5 tracks of like some spooky things that I can throw in to like the background to kind of thicken things up. And if you are on a system where you can hear these things, like some good headphones or some monitors, or like you got those like crazy Henry Rollins $250,000 speakers, maybe some of this will stand out to you. If not, then it does add to like kind of the thickness of the mix. Let's move on. What is this one? Spooky stuff. Hearing the bends, that sounds spooky. EQ on that. And whatever this is. So this is during the guitar solo. So there's not a whole lot of orchestra going on right there. So I use that to kind of fill in some of that space and add some of that ambience in the orchestra absence. So when the guitar solo is going on right here, a lot of the orchestra kind of drops out to make space for that guitar solo. But I'm stacking on this on top of that. Here's that overload system that comes in only when the guitar solo is playing. I'm not lying, my computer can't handle this mix. Let's move on from that. So FORZO, it's got a compressor on it. So yeah, NOVO and FORZO and VENTO all have compressors on it. It's just Pro C2, just kind of leveling things off a little bit, cutting out some of the very top stuff and bringing in the lower. Here we go. So that's the setting. I believe it's the same setting for each one. And then where's VENTO? Yeah, so each one has the same compressor on the bus. So NOVO, FORZO, VENTO bus has this compressor, threshold -20, ratio 4:1. Attack and release are right there. VENTO, let's check these guys out. What's going on here? Bending Sanity. So this right here is during the first bridge. So a bunch of ambient stuff happening beneath the surface. This is what this sounds like. This is during the verse. So that's actually directly following the melody. For any of these that are tuned, I am trying to complement or follow the melody that's happening within the song. And then Halloween, one of my favorite bands. Here's during the first part of the song. So that's going on underneath this. And it stops as the first verse enters. Staccatos, I believe this is actually going right along with the Woodwinds. Yeah. So actually, let me play that part for you in the Woodwinds, because I'm doing some kind of counter melody, crazy business going on in the orchestra, as well as the strings. So this extra notes, just kind of building up some tension. Sounded cool to me, so I threw it in. And then these staccatos from VENTO are following that basic thing going on in the real orchestra. So whole hybrid orchestra at once. I don't know, it's kind of spread out all over the place. So as the song progresses, different parts, I threw in other ambient elements. So what's going on in the beginning of the song? So let's check out this part right here in particular. There's a lot of stuff going on in the background during the guitar riff, during the break. Here's what I got stacked up. And then to play that section again in full context of the song. So yeah, that's probably the most extreme example of the hybrid orchestra in the song, because everything else just drops out. But let's move on to percussion, because this video is getting very long. So percussion, we got cymbal washes. So some of those into impacts and stuff going on throughout the song. Tubular bells. So these actually I think are really dope. And those are going along with bass drum hits, so the bass drum right here. So the tubular bells are from Native Instruments percussion. Bass drum I think is from Spitfire symphonic percussion. Put those together and then that's what you got. So bass drum hits throughout the song, wherever I need some extra impact. And then taikos. Those are usually kind of build up elements into an impact. So building up into the impact for that hit, kind of smooth things out. So then the timpani going right along with the main rhythm and the melody of the song. And then this is from Damage 2, Grand Casas. It's just a big drum that makes a low noise. And that's some weird other effect. They did some kind of scraping on the Grand Casas that has that ambience, and I had to do a pretty extreme EQ move on here because there's so much low end. I had to get it out of there so that you can actually hear the guitars and everything else that's supposed to be happening. And then you can see I automated that EQ back up after this part to give more of that low end for those percussive impacts. So to put that in context of the song, with all the percussion elements going on here, this is what it sounds like. So percussion it's a little bit quiet in the mix, but it's there, just to kind of maintain that orchestral atmosphere and orchestral vibe that I'm going for this. EQ. Let's run through that real quick on these tracks. So here's the tubular bells, major high pass, major high end bump, taikos, boosting up some of the high end attack and high passing out all the rumble and the stuff I don't really need. Timpani, boosting is like the low end body and whatever this is, 636. Just trying to get some of that impact and the low end of the timpani out while also cutting out the rumble and keeping that high end in there. Bass drum, just boosting the low and cutting out all the rumble below 30. Grand Casas, similar kind of deal to the bass drum. Those are all going to the percussion bus, which starts with the Pro C2, so just kind of barely smoothing out the top end, and then going into DF Excite, boosting a little bit of the treble, some of the high mids and a little bit of the low mids, giving some saturation to the high end of the spectrum on the percussion. And then Pro Q3 for the whole percussion, cutting out 86 Hz for the kick drum, rolling off the rumble, and then boosting some of the high end for even more of the high end brightness and attack. All right, next group, atmosphere. So here's more risers, more sound effects, and more spooky stuff. So 3 voices. So during that part that we have been listening to, there's also this happening. So this is Thrill from Native Instruments. There's only 2 instances of it in this, but basically using it as a riser to kind of build tension into the next part. I'm also doing that with gravity risers. So and that happens twice. Each time is during this part. So again, it's very quiet in the mix, but I had to prioritize. I didn't want to get rid of it, but I didn't want to put it up in front and mask other things that are more important to ultimately the audience. This is a Spitfire thing, HG20, 2 degrees, whatever the thing is. Some weird high-end spooky thing. More Thrill, different setting on Thrill. And that is during the drum fill. So that high-end weird thing, listen for that as well as a little bit of a riser during this drum fill. And then keep in mind there's also the NOVO, the like digital noise up atop. And then there's also that vocal phasing going on. So that's why I had to turn up the drums to kind of combat all of that. And then also it's a drum fill, that's the feature. In the original song, everything else cuts out except for the drums. That's obviously not happening here, but I did my best to keep the ambience that I was going for as well as stay true to the original vibe of the Slayer song. So once again, this guy. Those 2 things. Listen for those again. Super subtle, so subtle I couldn't hear him. And then what is this? Scraped cymbal. It's just a scraped cymbal. A very gross scraped cymbal. The only EQ I have on any of these tracks is for this thrill, just rolling off the low end rumble because I don't really want that in contributing to the whole rest of the mix. Similar deal here with the compressor, rolling off any of the extreme dynamics, and then the overall EQ for this group. I'm doing a very extreme high pass right here, so I guess I didn't really need any of the EQ here. And then also cutting out some of the mid-range boxiness because I want the guitars, like remember the guitar pick attack and the definition of the tone is coming from this range, so I'm cutting it out of the sound effects, all this weird nonsense, so that way you can maintain that guitar sound without sacrificing it for some whooshes and spooky noises. Speaking of whooshes, here's a whole group of whooshes. So this is from Damage 2, Rise and Hit, Native Instruments. So at the beginning of the song, this Damage 2 right here. So that's where you're getting that initial impact from. So remember the beginning of the song as it starts that intro. So that main swell is coming from Damage. So Damage 2 has a bunch of different hits, and I just picked the ones that I thought sounded cool for the context of that part. And then Rise and Hit Gateway, this is... So that's going into the first verse. You might be able to hear this because I have the impacts turned up pretty high. You can definitely tell that high end from that gateway impact. Bunch more damage hits. No EQ on here, so I didn't EQ any of the impacts. There's a lot of high end, a lot of low end information, but they're there to kind of bring some shock to the mix. Really all I wanted was to balance them in properly, so that way they'd serve the purpose to make an impact on the mix and then kind of disappear, leaving room for the rest of everything else going on. And then there's actually another whole group of hits. Damage 2 again, and then Gravity has their own hits. So Damage 2 hits, so these they just have like a direct attack and then a decay. And that happens right at this point. So those impacts I'm using to kind of transition in between parts as well. And so these swells that go into the impact, and then the impact brings a lot of energy in, and then I tried my best to maintain that energy in the next part of the song, or use it to change your focus of what's happening into impact and then what's happening next. Gravity hits, here's a couple examples of these. And then this guy right here. So that is actually coming after these hits into the second verse. So see if you can notice that. So that low end is coming from that hit, as well as a little bit of that high end that's poking through. I have some unused buses here. I was doing some rerouting and stuff, so don't mind those. And then on the hits group, I've got some extra low mid, maybe a little bit more bass, and that's about it. All right, vocals. Whole lot of stuff going on with the vocals. So vocals are a nested summing stack. So I got the main vocal track group here. So what I did with the vocals, you can see there are 4 vocals happening for the main voice. And then the pre-chorus, there's some yelling going on as well, and then some different panned stuff. I'll play these in solo for you. So the main vocal, I have these 4, basically kind of different attitudes and different tonalities for each performance. And then I have them balanced, and also these 2 middle ones, I have panned slightly left and right, so that way it kind of brings some width to the vocals. So the first one, here's what my voice sounds like, just... And then I'll go to this one. There's effects and stuff happening still, and then the third one. So you can hear how each one kind of has its own attitude. The main one that I have is main 1. That's supposed to be like the more straightforward, in-your-face one, and then the main 2 and 3 have their own sort of more intense personalities. Main 4, I wanted a lower register. This one in particular, I was very much like hunched over, had the microphone like this, and I was like kind of leaning, hunching down to get the lowest I could, as close to Septic Flesh as I could. So when you stack them all together, this is the effect.
Infiltration plus reserves in circular front lines. Supreme arbitrary blowing on the minds. Bomb vital submission taken to the graves. Vindication of triumph, the numbers that I attain.
So you're seeing all these plugins going on here. So Spiff, remember Spiff, the transient enhancer? I have that on the first and the fourth vocal track, and I have it on a preset called Rap Vocal In Your Face. Made it sound better to me. It just kind of produces a more defined transient for when I'm trying to articulate a word. It makes it a little bit more articulate. Then I increase that even more with Transify. So this is a JST plugin. I don't know what you're supposed to use this on, but I'm using it on my vocals to get more intense transient action. The idea behind that is to make the voice more clear. Because there's 4 vocal tracks, and because I'm trying my best to focus more on the tone in the voice rather than the enunciation. Unfortunately, I'm not the best singer, so I'm making up for my lack of enunciation with transient enhancers. And then gain reduction, my go-to vocal compressor. You just literally, you just load this up and it's the perfect vocal compressor. I do a lot of aggressive music. This is made for aggressive music. Perfect. Let me, real quick, turn on and off these transients enhancers and see if you notice the difference in the articulations.
Infiltration plus reserves in circular front lines. Supreme arbitrary blowing on the minds.
So we'll play that again.
Infiltration plus reserves in circular front lines. Supreme arbitrary blowing on the minds. Bomb.
So it adds a little bit more attack and definition to the words. It's not much, but any little bit helps in this scenario, because there's so much going on. You need to be able to understand the words if you know the words. Okay, so then we'll turn off the compression. You will definitely notice a difference without the compression.
Infiltration plus reserves in circular front lines. Supreme arbitrary blowing on the minds. Bomb vital submission taken to the graves.
So yeah, gain reduction levels everything out and brings up all of the lower voicings, brings down the higher voicings, just makes everything aggressive in your face and awesome. Main 4, I also have Devil Lock on here. So this is just like a very extreme distorter saturator. So let's go back over here. So I'll turn it off and notice you'll hear the signal's a little bit cleaner. I don't have this doing much, but so it adds a little bit of dirt to it. So now let's go over the EQ. So main 1. So this is very much focused on like the mid-range and the high end of the vocals. Main 2. So I have high pass and high cut to focus on that mid-range, and then bumped up where this vocal sits best. So main 3, bumped up the mid-range, rolled off a lot of the high end. And then main 4, bumping up a little bit of the mid-range, and then kind of keeping things pretty even, so that way I can keep the high end articulations of the low growls while also keeping the body. Notice the high pass is a lot lower on this case. 80 hertz, that's pretty low for vocal. All right, let's move on to pre-choruses. So notice there's 2 on the left, 1 in the middle, and 2 on the right. Just put on layers because I could. Just a bunch of me saying, support the war support. That's the whole pre-chorus. Then there's the yells that are layered on top of that as well. But yeah, just recorded that 5 times. Threw on gain reduction for compression, and then Pro Q3. Let's see what this is actually doing. Pre-chorus L. So this is the left 1, and then left 2. This is the center channel, then right 1, and right 2. So those are the EQ moves I did for that to make it kind of cleaned up and sit well with everything going on as best I can make it. I keep saying sit well, but you know, I could be doing everything all wrong. If you see something I'm doing wrong, please correct me in the comments and let's learn together. So main vocals, that's all going on to this bus. Okay, so the main vocal bus has Joel Wanasek bus glue going on. I don't have any compression on this, but what I am using is this aggro knob. I just have it set to 17%, doing a little bit more aggressive saturation for what Joel Wanasek likes for vocals. So let me turn this on and off and see if you hear a difference.
Reserves in circular front lines. Supreme arbitrary blowing on the minds. Bomb vital submission taken to the grave.
So it just makes it a little bit nastier. And then little altar boy, I'm also not pitch shifting or formant shifting, but I am adding a little bit more drive to make it even another layer of nastiness. So if I turn this on and off, let's start with off.
Reserves in circle of the lines, supreme unexpected, blowing on the minds, bomb by to submission, take down to.
So it's a very subtle effect, but I wanted it because Jesse Cannon recommended it. So that's his fault. And here's the EQ curve for the whole vocals. I'm seeing now that I high passed at 108 Hertz when my low vocal over here was high passed at 80 Hertz. So this got kind of overwritten by the group as a whole. Oh well. And then cutting out some of the low end muddiness and then boosting right above that in that 500 Hertz range. Just very slight moves, but needed to make that space. Here is the buses, so bus 24 and 25, for all of the like the reverb and effects and delays and stuff that you've been hearing. So send one, so some reverb, and then I boost it on some of the key parts, and then delay. So I'm throwing vocals into the delay track at these key parts. So if I pause it right here, notice how there's a little bit of reverb, but none of the delay. And if I bring it into that delay section, all that signal will be thrown into the delay track, and then you'll hear all kinds of stuff happening. So you'll hear those vocal decay in the mix, but all the other instruments kind of mask it at a certain point. So let me show you that in context. So you hear how it's still going, even though I've paused it now, but by like this point, you can't really hear it anymore. So I wanted enough echoes to hear that there is an echo, but it gets masked at a certain point. All right, so then the yells are a whole separate group. So this beginning intro part. So that fades into the main vocals, and I'll play that in context. So just 3 different screams all layered together and coming up into that first verse. The main yells are here. So pre-chorus 1, so we'll solo this. I do have a pitch shifter on here because I was like 1 semitone off in my original yell. So let's see. So if I turn this pitch shifter off and solo this, you'll notice that I'm a little bit flat. And then, so pitch shift to fix up my error, and then yeah, just pan hard left and right to give that width. 2 different performances for each one of the pre-choruses. So gain reduction because it's a vocal track, and that's what I use for vocal compression. And then Pro Q3 for the left, a high pass, high end bump, and then for the right, same kind of bump. And then War Cry, here is those 3 screams in the beginning. Gain reduction, Pro Q3 for the first one. Very similar curves for all these. And there you have it for those 3. Side widener I have for this one that's panning right to left, just to kind of give it even more of a widening effect. All right, so these, when I actually yell war into the second guitar solo, that's what these are. And then just compression, no EQ or anything. I have this pretty aggressive fade out. It doesn't really sound like it when you solo it, but this is going through layers of compressors. And so as these ones fade out, the growls up here sort of take priority in the compressor. So if I solo all of this, all of the vocals, you'll hear the yells kind of fade out as the growls come into play more. So that's the part leading into the second guitar solo. So it's a little bit in the background. The guitar solo is definitely taking priority over that, but it's there to kind of add extra ambience and extra just kind of aggression and anger to that section. And then the yells going to bus 24 and 25 for reverb and delay on their own. And then these yell tracks also going into Joel Monosek bus glue vocals with the same aggro setting, so not really doing any compression because the compression is done by gain reduction, but I wanted that extra aggro. Also, little Ultra Boy, same setting as the main vocals, Pro Q3. Really just kind of focusing on the upper mid range, doing an aggressive high pass and high cut. So that way, this is kind of where the meat of the vocals are. So I want to get rid of all the low end information because that's where I want other things to sit, like the growls. And then the high end information, leave that space for the guitars and the orchestra and whatever else is going on. All right, so then on to sound effects. So we got foot stomps. So what I did with this actually, so I downloaded a sample pack of just a bunch of footsteps and I put those into the Logic sampler, like just a whole bunch of them all at once, and I just slammed the keyboard to the beat to trigger a whole bunch of them all at once. And then I'm sending them through this EQ, some brightening boost, but getting rid of the 2K because that was not contributing properly, I guess. Okay, yeah, some kind of like the boxy impact or whatever in the foot stomp range. And then Pro R for reverb, and then I'm also adding chroma verb just because I wanted a lot of reverb for this because it's supposed to sound like a lot of footsteps. Reverb helps make it sound bigger than it actually is. And then side widener because I want it to sound bigger than it actually is. Flame burst, so I'm actually using this for impacts. So if I solo this, you'll hear. So this is from Boom Library from their Fire and Water set. Pretty cool organic flame sound that's going into this bridge down section. So this is that major impact crazy section. So mainly what you're getting from that is a lot of that low end information, some of that boom, and adds to that impact that we're also getting in gravity and these whooshes. So those stacked up together create that impact going into that second bridge. And then at the very outro, more flame bursts and then a flame burn, different sounds from that Boom Library sample pack. And so those on their own. And notice this automation line up here. So what I did was, because the flame right here is the last thing you're hearing, there's a lot of low end information. And so what I'm doing, I'm automating a high pass filter. So as it fades out, I'm filtering out the low end. So that way the rumble in your subwoofer or whatever else, that information isn't being passed through. It kind of helps make the fade out more believable, kind of like you're coming away from the fire. You probably saw there's a lot of low-end information in here that I'm cutting out because I want to simulate that feeling of the fire kind of disappearing off into the distance. All right, then these gunshots. These are also from Boom Library. It's from one of their free monthly packs of gun sounds. So altogether, there's this gun cocking sound, and then some gunshots that I retimed to match the tempo of the song. And then one last shot is its own track. And then you put those all together, and so you can see the panning lines. It's panning from left to right and then right to left, kind of like you're sweeping your machine gun back and forth. And then the EQ on those, for the first one, I tried to make them sound as similar to make it sound like one gun instead of three separate guns. So for the gun cock, this is the EQ curve on that. The gun shots, that's kind of like my bass line, and then the last gunshot, I had to add a little bit more high end and then cut out some of the low end. And then for the gun master bus, compression to kind of squeeze things together and make it more of a less dynamic signal. And then just like aggressive high pass and then boosting up this high end to make sure that the click of the gun sticks up above the mix. And then this goes right along with the guitar. So I actually changed the guitar part and the drum part to 16th notes to go along with these gunshots. Check it out. So I'll play just the gun and the guitar, and you'll hear those moving together. So the second one I didn't do the 16th notes just because it's already been established, but I do continue the 16th notes with the drums. So here's the gunshots with the drums. Yeah, and that adds that effect to it. So here at the end, we got these 5 sub mixes, and then I've got some automation stuff going on here. So what these are is I've got band. What this is drums, rhythm guitar, and bass. And so I've got a little bit of compression. So this is Pro C2. This is just the golden transparency preset. I like what it does to that. And then JST clip, just acting just slightly. Pro Q3. So this is where I'm starting to use mid and side modes for the EQ channels. So mid-side mode basically means you have your left channel and your right channel. Mid is what is going through both of them, and then side is what is going through each one individually. So a very simplistic mathematical way of thinking about it is mid is left plus right, side is left minus right, or right minus left. So in the mids, the center, I'm boosting up around 300 to get that, like, the guitar and the bass into the middle. So that's like the low end body of those instruments. I want those in the middle, and then cutting out the sides of 1800. So that way the orchestra can kind of live in that area. And you'll see if I go to the orchestra bus, I'm doing the opposite moves. So I'm boosting the sides in the orchestra as well as a little bit more of the high end on the sides, and then cutting out some of the mids in the orchestra on the lower end. So that way the lower end can be occupied by the band, and as the frequency spectrum goes from low to high, it prioritizes the band, and as it gets higher, it prioritizes the orchestra. It's very slight moves, but that's the idea behind these moves. So let's go back to the band, Pro Q3. So we got the mid and side moods. DF Excite, boosting a little bit of the high mids. I just have it on drum group. So DF plugins are made for drums, but I'm using it on the whole band right now. So boosting a little bit more of the high mid and dropping out some of the output. And so this is side chained to the vocal mix. So I'm cutting out some 500 hertz and some 1000. So this is kind of where the vocals live. A lot of 500, a lot of 1K in the vocals to give the definition and gives you more understanding of the words. But I have these as dynamic bands in the middle. So vocals are in the middle. There's some side stuff going on that can live with the rest of the band. So I'm just affecting the middle because vocals are prioritized for the middle. And I have them as dynamic EQ bands, side chained to the vocals, so that anytime the vocals are singing, it cuts these frequencies out. So for example, at the very beginning, notice these bands won't be active. Now if I go to the verse, you'll see these frequencies starting to get cut out. So that's a way of cutting out those frequencies of the band to make more room for the vocals without sacrificing those frequencies entirely. So let's move on to orchestra. So we got Saturn. I have barely nothing going on for this band level. I guess a little bit of drive in the low end and a little bit more drive in the high end, but I have it on clean tape. So that way it saturates the high end, fills in any information gaps that might be in there, but it's on a very clean signal, so it's not doing a whole lot. Let's see if we can even notice the difference. So yeah, adds a little bit more brightness to it. Pro Q3. So this is the same EQ move that I made on the band to make room for the vocals, only when they're active. Side chains to the vocal bus. Pro Q3. Here's where I make the space for the rest of the band, bringing up the sides on the high end and then bringing down the lows on the mid channel. And then here's the gates. Remember the snare and the tom spikes? Let's go back over here. So Epicons is not going into the orchestra bus over here. It's its own kind of thing. Because it's a hybrid sort of brass element, I have it on its own kind of separate track that is going into this orchestra bus over here. And so to minimize the amount of gates I'm using, I put the gates over here, so that way these gates act on the whole orchestra as well as that Epicons preset. So yeah, this is sidechain to snare and then toms, just ducking down a little bit for each one of those hits. All right, and then let's go to the vocal compressor. So this is where I am actually doing some Joel Wanisick compression, adding some extra aggression and some extra tone. So I'm not doing a whole lot of compression, just kind of leveling off the top of it. So I'm also sending the guitar solo to the vocal bus, so that way it can have its own kind of area away from the band. Notice that the compressor is acting a lot harder, the signal is a lot higher with the guitar solo coming through, and I basically did that to kind of prioritize the guitar solo over any vocals that might be going on underneath it, particularly in this build section where I'm doing the growl while the guitar solo is doing its cool tapping thing. So that's the compressor for that, and then the EQ, doing some high pass and a little bit of a bump around 1900. Gain, okay, yeah, this is for some automation. So I'm doing quite a lot of automation for the vocals as well as the guitar solo. Then impacts, so all the percussion and all the hits, those are going to the impacts bus, so bus 30. All the whooshes, all the percussion, that's all going to impacts. So any kind of thing it adds a sudden crazy burst of energy, including the footstomps and these flame bursts. So all the percussion and all the damage and gravity hits, this is a pretty good spot to see how all the things that are going into that. So that's the impacts bus. And then sound effects, this is basically the whole hybrid orchestra, all the spooky stuff that we looked at for NOVO, FORZO, VENTO, as well as all the atmosphere tracks. So all this crazy stuff. So what's going on in the sound effects is, first of all, track spacer. This is side chained to the orchestra. So the orchestra is ducking out any of these frequencies between 307 and 5200 hertz, and the ratio is only like 4.5%. So between this range where the orchestra is living, it's taking away information from these sound effects. And then Pro Q3 just cutting out some of the vocal range. And then Pro G, same deal with the snare spikes and the tom spikes, ducking those down anytime there's a hit, because I want those drums to impact. I want you to feel the drums. Even through the whole dense mix, I want you to feel the drums, and the drums need to have their place, because Slayer needs drums, and it's heavy metal needs drums. And you gotta be able to hear them. All of these submixes are then going into the final mix bus. So it starts off with Joel Wanasek bus glue mix. So this is the loudest part of the song. If we go to one of the quieter parts, like verse 1. So basically just have this sitting right where the lowest level is in the song. And then I have it set to iron mode and no small time. Add some character to it that I like. And then Ozone 9, this is doing quite a lot. So this is Ozone 9 Advanced. I have an equalizer here. This started off on a recommendation based off of, like, I did the master assistant and then just kind of tweaked things from there. So add a little bit more low end, and then what is this, 1800? And I'm doing actually a very aggressive high cut at 18,200. So 18,200 hertz. I'm doing a very aggressive high cut to get rid of like the very top end, like ear piercing frequencies. And I'm doing that within this EQ right here. And then kind of rolling off a little bit of the high end right here as well. Dynamics, this is a multi-band compressor. So I'll play this and you can see where each compressor is acting, and I'll kind of scroll through them and you can see the different settings for each one as well. So notice each one is acting a little bit, but each specific band isn't doing a whole lot on its own. Just kind of making sure each band is controlled in its own right. And then I have low end focus, just to kind of tighten up the low end. So I have it set to punchy mode. I contrast up 37% and then gain down. So if you turn up the contrast, it kind of brings up those transients and makes them louder. So to compensate for that, I turn down the gain. I have this set to 183, so everything below 183 hertz is being processed to make it a little bit less smooth and more punchy and aggressive. And then dynamic EQ, this is where it decided to put dynamic EQ points. If I play this, you'll see them acting a little bit. So that's that. And maximizer, this is the limiter within Ozone 9 that I have set to this level. So going back again to that loudest part of the song, which is the second half of the bridge, as well as the last chorus, but this is kind of what I kind of base everything off of. So you can see that blue line, it dips down anytime there's compression going on, but I did my best to set the threshold where there's like the bottom of the level action and then the ceiling right above where it peaks out. So that way there's compression going on, but not a whole lot of limiting. I have it set to IRC 4 modern. I basically picked that because it's exclusive to the advanced, and why wouldn't I pick the most advanced one? I don't know what it is, but it's because it's exclusive. And then this stuff is basically like the attack and release stuff for the Ozone compressor limiter, whatever this is, maximizer. So that's Ozone. And then moving on to JST clip, a little bit more aggressive with this. So any peaks that do survive through these first two compressors, I'm cutting those off, and that kind of brings up the body of the rest of the mix. So this one you'll be able to tell a difference if I turn it on and off. So let me turn it off, and then I'll turn it back on, and you'll notice a little bit of a volume difference. So it is slight, but it is noticeable. Everything in the master bus, you gotta be very careful not to overdo things. A lot of my earlier mixes were way overcooked, and I had to dial back a lot of these settings. So this is where I ended up for the final mix. I set it on 2, I just do the magic mastering preset. It makes it just more exciting, and you'll be able to tell with this one as well. So when I play this without it, it sounds fine, and when I turn it on, you'll notice it gets more exciting in the higher end. You'll see that clean tube is set, and there's quite a bit of drive going up to it. It doesn't make it sound any dirtier, it just makes it sound more intense. So yeah, that high-end saturation, just a little bit. And then more saturation through this Oxford inflator. So I have the curve set to 50, so plus 50 increases the fatness and volume enhancement. Then I have the effect set to 63, so it adds to it. Let's go to the bridge 2, and then you'll notice a difference with when I turn this on. So it's one of those things that it's probably fine without it, but it's better with it. So I want it included. And then Soothe 2. So I started with the preset of ear friendly top on master 2. And then I have the EQ focus set on the very high end. So any of those ear piercing frequencies, that's where I have this looking the most. So if we go anywhere, you'll see all the EQ that it's cutting out of the signal. And they have a cool delta mode, so I'll play for you just what it's cutting out. So let's see if you can hear the difference between Soothe on and off. So the idea behind this is to not notice a difference in the mix. It just makes it easier to listen to. So if you turn it up really loud, there's going to be a lot of frequencies that are going to be more piercing than others, and this is supposed to target those and kind of dynamically cut them out. So with Soothe, the goal is to make it sound the same but less fatiguing. So then we got Pro L2. This is the last limiter of the whole thing. So I'm basically just making sure that the song sits comfortably at 0. Any last peaks or last kind of stray transients get cut out at this point. You'll notice the reduction is very slight. I'm only adding 1 dB, and I have the style set to transparent, so I'm trying to make sure that this isn't really doing a whole lot except keeping the song at 0 dB for the master. Another cool thing about it is it also tells you how loud your song is in LUFS. Mine's hitting like -5 something, which is super loud, and I dig it. And then I have these plugins at the end. These are more like monitoring tools. So I have Metric AB. I've got some Fleshcat Apocalypse loaded in, as well as some Septic Flesh. So I was using these songs as my references. And then they've got analyzers and stuff that you can compare. So this one on the bottom is the Fleshcat Apocalypse in Eternum. You can kind of hover your cursor over here to make sure that your frequency graph matches up with theirs if you want your song to sound in the ballpark of the other reference tracks. There's all kinds of stuff you can check out in here. Total balance. So this is one of the isotope tools. So this also looks at your overall frequency spectrum, and if your spectrum fits within this graph, then you're in a pretty good spot. I'm a little hot around 6K, but it's still within the graph, so it still approves, and it sounds good to me, so I'll roll with it. This was actually shown to me by a hip-hop guy who was using this for his mixes, and I was very appreciative of him sharing that information. So this last EQ is for monitoring different frequency spectrums. Last thing I was looking at was the low end here. So if I turn this on and then move it up to 400, you'll hear all the fundamentals of all the instruments. You'll be able to hear everything that's going on. You'll be able to distinguish all the instruments, and then make sure that your low end is nice and clear and all the fundamentals are there. Let's check this out. So you can hear all the instruments, all the main instruments going on. And if we go even to bridge 2, where there's a bunch of choir and high things going on, you should be able to hear them slightly. So this is a good way of making sure that your low end is clear. As long as everything is audible in this range, that's a good indicator that your mix will cut through and be distinguishable. So you'll be able to tell the guitars from the bass, from the drums, from the vocals, from all the different things. So getting your low end tight, this is a great way to monitor that. And there's a bunch of other low mid definitions, so making sure everything in here sits right. There's more explanations about all this stuff that you can learn from URM. This is where I learned all my mixing stuff. But yeah, we can just turn that off at the end because we don't want this EQ to be acting up on the final sound. That's just for monitoring, for my own personal referencing. So that's the whole mix. That's everything that went into making War Ensemble on the audio end of things. I've showed you just about everything that you could want to know about this. There's more details that we could dive into, but this is already like 2 hours long of a thing. So if you watched this far, you're a fucking nerd, and I very much appreciate you. And if you have any questions or comments or any suggestions or any kind of thing, if you saw me doing something stupid that I could be doing better, drop a comment down below, and let's learn together. So thank you for sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got some value out of it. I hope this was entertaining and informative. Yeah, so that's War Ensemble for you. So go check it out, go watch the video again now that you've kind of had an inside look at what's going on. Add it to your Apple Music and Spotify, and you can listen to it in the car and reference on a bunch of different systems. And let me know what you think, or whatever. I don't know. Just leave a comment, share this video or whatever with your audio engineering friends. But anyway, I'll get out of here and let you get back to your life. Thank you.